Okay, so what I hope we'll achieve in the next quarter of an hour is that we'll appreciate some of the differences between the way patients look at things and researchers and professionals. That you'll get to know a little bit about how outcome assessment in rheumatoid arthritis has been changed by involving patients. And I hope you'll get enthusiastic to involve patients in your own research work. What I'm going to talk about is what is the problem of assessing outcome in rheumatoid arthritis? Why were patients included in OMERACT? For those who don't know, OMERACT is a group of clinicians and methodologists and other people who are very interested in measuring outcomes in clinical trials. And they are a self-selected group of people who meet every 2 years and do lots of work in between times. And if you'd like to join, you're very welcome. What happened when we got patients involved? What did we learn about it? And what are we going to do from here? So in the past, we used to, doctors decided whether outcomes were good or not. It didn't really matter if the patient died. It was a successful operation. It was a pity about the patient. That wasn't really good enough. Clinical trials were brought into effect. Somebody got it wrong. The first clinical trial published in rheumatology was in 1951. As far as I know, it was the second randomized controlled trial ever published. The first one was on the treatment of TB, and it was in the UK, just so you know. And the trouble is, clinicians in rheumatology used to decide what outcomes were important, and they all used to disagree with each other. Let me just show you some information. Rheumatologists who spend lots of hours every day deciding whether patients have responded to second-line therapy were given this information about patients before and 6 months after starting DMARD therapy. And they were asked on a chart like this to indicate whether this patient had got better or got worse. And the same patient information was given to 38 different rheumatologists. And this was the results that the rheumatologists gave. Maybe you think I've picked a particularly difficult patient. We actually did it with 50 patients, and I'll show you a few more. Actually, these patients are just randomly selected from the 50. So this is the extent of our expertise. I tell you, this is better than primary care physicians and better than the general population. But it isn't very good. Two rheumatologists who actually worked together, were supposed to be partners in the same clinic, had their analysis of patients' severity analysed mathematically to find out which information they were using to decide if patients were good or bad for their arthritis. And this was the first one, and this was the second one. One worked for the other, and the more senior thought the more junior was doing what they were told. But I won't tell you which was the more senior. We did consider pasting these charts on the outside of the clinic rooms of the doctors so that patients could choose which doctor to go to have their arthritis assessed in the way that they thought was best for them. But I wasn't allowed to do that. So what did we do when we realized that, doctors are not very consistent? Well, what we did is internationally, through OMERACT and at ACR and at EULAR and various other places, we tried to standardize assessments. And actually, I agree with Ed Yellen at the beginning. Rheumatology is ahead of the game with all this. We started this 20 years ago. We developed a core set of outcome measures. These measures met the OMERACT filter of truth, discrimination, and feasibility. They were popular amongst doctors and methodologists. They didn't include some measures because it wasn't possible to measure them properly, so they were just omitted. And this is what they were. Sorry, the button here is not very responsive. That's why all the speakers are having their slides come up slowly. So there's now international agreement that we should measure these things in rheumatoid arthritis. This agreement has been taken up by the drug regulatory authorities and therefore has been implemented by pharmaceutical companies. And as pharmaceutical companies do most clinical trials, this is a huge success. We have a standardized approach to measuring outcome in rheumatology against the odds. And I'm really pleased with all that. So what do we do next? Well, you've heard a little bit about what we did next. Some researchers were already working on including patient-defined outcomes in their measures. And at OMER 5 in 2000, the community there decided to try and define threshold for changes, one of the suggestions you've heard in our theoretical presentation just now. And then they sort of realized, well, actually, that depends on who decides what is important. So, OMER 5 became a stimulus for incorporating the patient's view into outcomes. And since then, quite a lot of work has been done. A multidisciplinary network has been established. It meets during the ACR meetings. It started in 2000. It's had informal sessions at subsequent meetings and at ULAR meetings, and of course, people involved go to the OMER meetings. So there's an international interaction about this. And it's been quite busy. We talked about using focus groups. We talked about the limitations of currently accepted assessments. We talked about how pain might be assessed and how patients' priorities for improvement differ across different areas of health. We talked about the personal impact of disability. And these discussions have opened a broad area of research using quantitative and qualitative approaches and occurring in several countries around the world. So we got to OMER 6, which was 2 years later, and we had the first patient perspective workshop at OMER 6. And this produced a research agenda. And it also persuaded OMER that more patients should be involved. The patient perspective group specifically wants to make sure the patient's perspective is incorporated into standard measures. At the first one, there were 11 patients. There's 5 working groups, and there were 43 other methodologists and clinicians involved in the workshop. And there's no doubt that patients' participation changed the nature of what we were doing. Reviews of the available evidence made it clear that patients and professionals view the outcome of rheumatoid arthritis differently. And many consequences of the disease that were important to patients were not being addressed and were not in the core set. So having given ourselves a nice pat on the back for doing well, we now realised that we'd only half done well and we'd left the patients out. Well, actually, the patients made it very clear to us that they'd been left out. I'd like to give you a couple of examples. This one's from my colleague Sarah Hewlett, who's in the audience. And she surveyed opinions about the importance of different outcomes included in the health assessment questionnaire. And if you just took non-arthritic control people from the general population, these were the relative importance scores that people got. If you took patients, they were different. And healthcare workers, including nurses and physiotherapists and occupational therapists and so on, who always think they're better at this than doctors, scored these. So sometimes we have the same sort of appreciation as our patients, but at other times we're way out. And another piece of work from Patricia Minnick and Brandy Bresnell in Dublin. Patricia has a group of women who she's following up with rheumatoid arthritis, and when she first saw them, she asked them how important were the different outcomes to their rheumatoid arthritis. And she saw them again 5 years later and asked the same questions again and got very much similar results, except the second time she'd been influenced by the OMER meeting that she was at, and she included a further outcome measure that she hadn't included at baseline, and that outcome measure was fatigue. And fatigue turned out to be the single most important thing from a patient's point of view, which she had never guessed because she hadn't asked patients about what should be included in the original list. So we developed a research agenda at OMER 6, which covered 3 broad areas. And we had another patient perspective workshop at OMER 7, at which there were 20 patients from around the world. And we fed back the progress on work which had been done in the intervening 2 years. Quite a lot of things had been going on. We also tackled new issues that had arisen from that research progress. Quite a lot of things going on. So you can see that a lot of questions had been raised and a lot of people had started working on these areas. The main topics of the research agenda are set out here, and in my handout I've included a brief description of each area with more details, and you can read about them in the report of OMRAC 7, which has just been published, slightly late, but it's just come out last week in the Journal of Rheumatology. So are we still making progress? Well, yes, we are, I'm pleased to say. At this meeting, at the ACR meeting, there are a number of reports about progress in rheumatoid arthritis. And here they are. Again, you've got details in the handouts. And of course, at this conference today, you will be hearing, especially in some of the later presentations and looking at some of the posters, about some more progress on incorporating these patient-centered outcomes in our research, and particularly in our clinical trials. If you're interested in this, you might like to come to the Patient Perspectives in Outcome Research Study Group, which is an ACR study group, and that's meeting on Wednesday in room 32, just along the corridor, and it's being run on this occasion by Ingmar Petersen, who's also in the audience today. You'd all be very welcome to come to that. Also, you might be interested in what the OMRAC Patient Perspective Group is doing, and there is an informal update which isn't in your program, so you might make a note of this, on Tuesday in the early evening, and it's in what's called the OMRAC suite, which is actually somebody's hotel suite, but which we keep using all during the day to have little meetings from the OMRAC interest groups. And ours is at 6:15 on Tuesday, and you'd be very welcome to come. Or if you'd just like to be kept informed about what's going on, you can join our email interest group by emailing me, and I'll just put you on the list and you'll get copies of stuff that we send out from time to time. So there's a few things we've learnt. Involving patients in outcomes research changes things. Patients have major concerns about some of the things that we don't measure. And measuring fatigue stands out as a major issue, and it's currently being addressed by several groups. So where do we go from here? Well, that depends on you. What are you going to do about it? How can you make patients' perspective incorporated in the work that you do? Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.